This is College Talk with Dean Aldemaro Romero Jr., a weekly program exploring the lives and work of the people of the Weissman School of Arts and Sciences at Baruch College.
Hello, everybody. Dr. Esther Allen is a native of Auburn, California. She obtained her bachelor's in arts degree in comparative literature from Scripps College in California and her doctorate also in comparative literature from New York University. Currently, she is an associate professor in the Department of Modern Languages and Comparative Literature in the Weissman School of Arts and Sciences at Baruch College, City University of New York. Welcome to College Talk, Dr. Allen.
It's great to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
Well, when I met you, I remember that I learned that your specialty, so to speak, is translations. And that is interesting because I think most of the general public thinks that a translator is someone who knows two languages, sits in front of the computer, reads the original text, and then type in a new text. But there is much more to that, right?
Absolutely. And I think actually it's interesting. I would have said most of the general public had that perception maybe 10, 15 years ago. I would often encounter people 10 or 15 years ago who assumed that we were living in a Star Trek universe and that, at some point the computer would just take over and no one would need to translate anymore. And we would just have instant communication with even the most alien of alien beings from the far reaches of the galaxy. Mm-hmm. And fascinatingly enough, I think that the development of machine translation and tools that are readily available to everyone like Google Translate and the deep imperfections of those tools has made people much more aware of what a translator does and of how difficult translation is. So in a funny way, I think that the very technology that people assumed would replace translation has instead had the opposite effect and made people much more aware of how difficult meaning is, what an incredibly elusive thing meaning is, that language is not a code. It's much more complex than a code. And meaning is something you have to create.
Well, in fact, my wife, she teaches Spanish, and she sometimes when she comes home, she says, I can tell exactly when a student uses Google Translator because it has a style on its own that you can say, no, this is not all, even someone trying to learn the language. It's someone who get it from a computer. And that point that you bring up is very important because I don't think that people understand that, and you have seen that in many great literature works, that you can compare different translations, they are not the same, which tells you there is a personal investment and also I would say a literary tradition being expressed through the translator, him or herself.
And a particular moment in time also. It's interesting, I was looking at some translations of Chekhov done at different periods, the same text done at different periods by the same man. And one in sort of, before he got married, and the second after he got married, and corresponding with this sort of burgeoning feminist consciousness in the early 70s. And he had translated all men, and then in the second version it was all humans, right? So I think that it was just an unconscious thing to reflect the Russian as all men in the earlier translation, and then when he went back and revised it, he realized what was being left out, right? So translators reflect a lot of different things, their own personal experiences, the political consciousness of their moment, the literary trends of their moment, and also, of course, an individual sense of what the text means, because we're never, ever going to agree. If you look at a tradition of literary criticism within a single language, it's not as if people who are all reading the text in the same language agree on what it means.
Yeah, well, and that is also an interesting point because, like in any profession, there are translators and there are translators.
Right.
Okay, sometimes I have read translations of something that I knew from Spanish or even English into Spanish, and I have a hard time recognizing the original text. We has come this old phrase that from in Italian that says traduttore traditore, that who translates commits treason in some way. How do you train students that are interested into translation not to be traitors of the original intent of the author?
Well, it's really a training in reading I'm teaching my students how to read. We actually begin with a semester-long course in practical translation, where we spend a lot of time actually translating brief pieces of journalism. And what they learn is that if they don't understand what the article is about, if they don't understand the story, they're not going to be able to translate it. So they have to do a lot of research. Like right now, we've been looking at the problems of Lula, the president of Brazil. Mm-hmm. It's actually a lovely escape from everything in this country. We're not thinking about that. We're looking at Lula. If they don't really understand what's going on with Lula mm-hmm. and this whole complex Operation Car Wash, Lava Jato, everything, mm-hmm. they can't translate the story. Mm-hmm. So they understand from the very beginning that they have to have a full grasp of the context. And then after that, they can start looking at the individual words. But if they just start out going word by word with a dictionary, mm-hmm. they're going to get nowhere, and they see that immediately. Yeah. So obviously, as in any sort of creative endeavor, you can't guarantee that every student is going to come out a genius translator, but you can at least make them aware of what's at stake mm-hmm. and what they need to do.
I know this because my father was a musician, that some of the best conductors are the ones that not only read the score of the composition from Bach or Mozart or whoever that might be, but also get in depth in the work of the composer, even into the life of the composer, to really get a grasp of what exactly was the intention when writing that piece. Do good translators do the same thing, not just try to translate things, but also to know even the biography of the author to get a grasp of what they're trying to say?
Absolutely, absolutely. I think that when you're translating, there are two contexts, and translation is all about context. The joke is, how many translators does it take to put in a light bulb? Depends on the context. Mm-hmm. So you have to understand the context of the original, the context that the original emerges from, mm-hmm. both the broader literary context that the writer was writing into, the writer's own life, the writer's own concerns, the writer's own issues, and then the context you're translating into. So if you don't have a very strong grasp of both of those concepts, those contexts, which are also concepts, there's a strong possibility that you will fail the translation in some way, that you'll overlook aspects that are actually deeply important. And I have my students, when we do the literary translation class, they have to research the writer's obra, the sort of complete works of the writer, where this work fits in, what the essentials of the writer's biography are. They have to do a preface in which they demonstrate that they understand all of those things.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Now, there are, I guess, different genres that have different levels of difficulty when it comes to translation. My guess is that when you're translating technical literature, like a scientific book, it's much more straightforward, because it's trying to describe something that is very factual, that has already established lexicon and all that sort of things. But I think on the other extreme will be things like poetry, because the way poets write, it is trying to say a lot of things in very few words, and even trying to make things to sound better because of the rhyming of that.
Right.
Do you think that poetry is probably the most difficult genre in order to translate and provide the reader with what that author was trying to say?
I would say yes. I mean, difficult is maybe not the word I would use. Possibly pleasurable might be the word that I would use, mm-hmm. because in the rich ambiguities of poetry, there's such a strong invitation to a creative re-inhabiting, mm-hmm. Of a text that really does involve the individual at all sorts of different individual levels. Whereas difficulty, you don't think of difficult things as necessarily being all that pleasurable. One of my mentors, Michael Henry Heim, actually did a study of translation in the social sciences, which we might assume to be a very straightforward thing, except that why would we assume that? High-level training in sociology equips people with a very specific vocabulary, a very specific set of concepts, and ways of expressing those concepts that is distinct from language to language. So if you give someone who is not a sociologist, who doesn't have that high-level mm-hmm. training, a sociological text to translate, chances are you're going to get something that doesn't really jive with the sociological rhetoric in the new context. So Heim made an argument that high-level translation should become one of the activities of social scientists, one of the tenurable activities, because otherwise the social sciences are going to go the way of the hard sciences and everything will be written in English. And it's particularly sad when you have people who are studying, the history of Mexico, and they feel that they have to write it in English in order to gain academic credit and, advance in their careers, which is something that we've actually seen.
Well, and I think that leads to another topic, which is the English language becoming almost a lingua franca, not only because probably the spread of the internet that uses mostly English for communication, but also in academia particularly, that if you want to be recognized, the only way you can ensure that everybody you want to have your work being read, regardless of the subject, is an English speaker, or at least an English reader of that. And I was wondering to what extent that is modifying the way English itself is being written, because now you're getting people who are translating their thoughts in their own original language, using English words, but sometimes in ways that an English native wouldn't ever use.
Well, I think there's actually a French author who has proposed an actual sort of second English, which consists of the most basic English that he says he can teach anyone in about 2 weeks for sort of English for international communication purposes. And I think English has always existed, of course, at many different levels and many different things. What concerns me, and what I think that the burgeoning interest in translation in the English-speaking world is in part a response to, is the violence of saying to someone, if you don't express yourself in English, you will not be heard. I worked on a book once, and the title that was given to it, which was not my choice of title, it was the Catalan Institute that was paying for it, was To Be Translated or Not to Be. I felt like for me as an English speaker to give that title would be violent, but for the Catalans to put it on their book was an expression of the plight they felt themselves to be in.
Yeah.
And I think that the existence of a substantial sector in the English-speaking world that is interested in translation and that gives people the opportunity to be translated creates the opportunity for that violence, to go away, and for people to be able to feel that they can express themselves in the linguistic traditions that formed them, that they were educated within, that they feel most strongly attached to, which is, what we're trying to do. Curiously, to go back to our earlier point about technology, in the 90s, when the internet was in its inception, and it was primarily in English because it emerged out of the English-speaking world, there were a lot of thinkers who thought, okay, this is the kind of the end of linguistic diversity, and we're just going to see a world in which English takes over and, everyone speaks English. And in fact, the internet itself is now only about 20% in English. What has happened is that the internet itself has become a place where many, many different linguistic groups can flourish, can create spaces for themselves. And even languages that were dying, indigenous languages, have been bolstered by the internet. People in these groups that are widely separated from each other can connect over the internet and reinforce the knowledge of the language that they have. So the internet has actually done the exact opposite thing in this as well, to what people assumed in the 90s would be the future. It's interesting.
Not only that, I agree with you. And a lot of people don't know this, but there are a number of endangered languages there, as when we talk about endangered species. And the technology has helped to, if not rescue all of them, to at least preserve some of them, because thanks to the digital technology, we can record what people are saying, analyze them actually using technology, and get a sense of how dialects have emerged, how they have died, how they have absorbed different words, and all that. So I think you're absolutely right with that. And as you know, one of the areas that is becoming the most interesting in the humanities right now is digital humanities.
Right.
It's the use of all these type of things.
Right.
But again, I don't think we will ever be able to come up with a translator that really, because talking about to be or not to be, I have read I not only know the play in English, but when I read different translations in Spanish, each translation is different.
Right.
I mean, to be or not to be, ser or no ser. Okay, but from then on, you can see some translations that sound like crude, like, okay, there's literal translation, but it's not the meaning of the author. And that's when the human touch really plays a major role.
The performance, right? We can watch 10 different performances of Hamlet in English.
Yeah.
And each actor is going to have a completely different take on who Hamlet is, what matters about Hamlet. So how much more is a translator who's choosing each word?
Yeah.
Those actors are all saying the same words.
Yes.
And imbuing them with different emotions. So a translator who's actually choosing the words that will be said, how much more of a performance is that, right?
So would you say that a translator, although it comes from the humanities in terms of the languages, is also in many ways a social scientist, because just like linguistics, you need to use all these other tools and all the other contexts to really understand what you're doing?
Absolutely. I think a translator also has to be a bit of a historian, certainly in terms of looking at the history of the language and the ways that it's changing. You have to be many, many things, and what I love is seeing how my students, who have, for the most part, my Baruch students especially, have been translating and interpreting for their entire lives. But when they start analyzing it as a thing that is a separate area of endeavor, which they tend never to have thought about, it's just something they have to do, right? But when they start thinking about it in a clear and dispassionate way and looking at it, learning about false cognates, for example, which is always a big eye-opener, it's very engaging to them. They become really interested in seeing how different the two language spheres that they inhabit are, and all of the transactions that they have to go through in order to effectively negotiate between them. And I think that it's very useful for them, and this is what they tell me at least, that it's very useful for them, even if they don't actually plan to become professional translators or interpreters, it's just extremely useful for them in their daily life and in their work life, no matter what.
Tell me about something I have noticed in some cases, which is you have a piece of work, let's say, that is originally in French and wants to be translated into English. But instead of having one translator, you have one translator, and both of them are knowledgeable of both languages. But one is a native English speaker, and the other one is a native French speaker. How common is that becoming in order to get a translation that tries to be really true to the original intent?
Well, there've always been translation pairs. I mean, most famously, Ezra Pound translated Chinese poetry without understanding basically a word of Chinese. He just had a co-translator who furnished him with a kind of word-by-word map of the original Chinese poem, and then Ezra Pound sort of wove it into an English poem and transformed the course of 20th century English poetry by doing that. There is a couple, Pavira and Volokonsky, who translate Russian classics. She's a native speaker of Russian. He's a native speaker of English. So that can work. But I think most translations are generally done by a single person, and generally that person's native language is the target language, because it turns out that to create an effective translation in English, you have to be a good writer in English. That's actually more important. That Borges used to say, the original is a detail. And obviously, if you're misunderstanding the original completely, that's not going to be a good thing, but you can actually get have a very strong grasp of the original without being particularly fluent in that language, if you're reading it carefully and slowly and using a dictionary and things like that. Nowadays, most translators that I know of are very fluent in the original language, even if it's not their native language. And there are some translators who go in two directions. This weekend at the American Literary Translators Association conference, I had a chance to meet my hero, Achi Ovejas, a Cuban-American who translated Junot Diaz's The Wondrous Life of Oscar Wilde into Spanish, but who also translates Cuban novels into English. So to me, that's extraordinary. She is really amazing. I'm hoping to get her to come to Baruch. I think I've got her to come in November.
Good. Excellent. Well, you are raising there a very interesting point, being really the native of the target language. And I'm saying that because as someone whose language is, my native language was not English, it was Spanish, And although I feel I'm totally fluent in English, I still have problems with prepositions.
Right.
Because there are no really rules for prepositions. That's something that you kind of learn by osmosis or something like that. And of course, I still, when I write, it's grammatically correct. But you can tell it's, well, you should have said 4 instead of 2, or that sort of things.
This is exactly what I say to all of my students, that they come in thinking that the problem of translation, the real difficulty of translation, is the big, long words that they don't understand. And I say to them, that's the easiest thing. You see a word, you don't understand it, you look it up, fine, now you know what it means. The hardest thing is the small words, the articles, the prepositions, and the skill of your translation is going to depend on your mastery of those small words. And it's very hard for them to grasp that initially, but then as we do hands-on work and we're really getting into the text, they quickly come to agree with me. And I have all kinds of preposition dictionaries. We have all kinds of strategies for figuring out how to get the right preposition, but it remains difficult.
Yeah. And that's also interesting because there are so many countries that are English-speaking countries or Spanish-speaking countries that depending from which country the translator is from, he's going to use even some words that are not the normal ones. I mean, talking about an apartment, a British will say a flat.
Right.
In Spanish, in Latin America, it's apartamento, but in Spain will be a piso. So that is the other thing. You may be doing a great job as a translator, but not really talking to particular audiences within that same country. How do you deal with that kind of challenges?
Well, it's a fantastic thing at Baruch because I have students in my classes who come from many different backgrounds. So essentially I have representatives of, 8 or 9 different varieties of Spanish. So we already have that present in, the lexicon of the classroom. The students will get into fierce arguments. No, you would never say it that way. Oh, yes, you would say it that way, right? So we all, it's this issue of context. And I point out, for example, that if we were in England, we would be using prepositions and even punctuation in different ways, but we're not. We're in the United States. And so we're always deeply conscious of what context are you coming out of and what context are you going into within the many varieties of the different of the 2 languages that we're going between.
Those students that you have in your classes who are interested in translation, have they shared with you why they became interested in translation as an art form?
Well, most of them, I would have to say, are not interested in translation as an art form. They're interested in translation as a viable skill that is marketable. Okay. And they're interested in that because their employers are telling them that. If they put on their resume minor in Spanish-English translation, people in their job interviews look at that and say, oh, that's great, we need that here. As you know, New York City is 30% Hispanic at this point. It's the largest Hispanic city in the United States. So it's a marketable skill. And what I try to do is harness that interest in acquiring a marketable skill, which is an extremely valid interest, and I'm interested in helping them acquire that marketable skill, and turn it into a larger issue in the humanities, which is the issue of creative expression and intercultural communication and, cultural transference and all of these other things. So they kind of sign up for something practical and, financially advantageous, and then we move beyond that into these larger questions of the humanities, and they're generally quite willing to do that. They're quite excited about that.
You just mentioned also a term I think is very important, which is the cultural aspect. In fact, as you know, many departments of modern languages are also called modern languages and cultures, because I think people are understanding now that culture is really key to really understand a language. Even if you think you understand it, that doesn't mean that you really get it. I mean, in Japanese, for example, someone told me who lives in Japan is when you hear a Japanese person saying hi, it's not saying yes. It's saying, I understand what you're saying. Doesn't mean that he or she is in agreement with what you're saying. But for us in the Western world, we say when someone says sí or yes or something like that, it's okay, so you agree with me. So that's a kind of nuisances that I think we need also to teach our students.
Absolutely. And that can happen within English. You know, communication between an American and someone from Britain can often become quite complicated because the American hears one thing and the Brit understands him or herself to be saying something quite different, right? So you always have to have this awareness of cultural context. Absolutely.
Well, I think I forgot who was the author of that quote that said that the United States and England are two countries separated by a common language.
Yeah, the assumption that you understand what the other person is saying can be very damaging.
Exactly, exactly. It's like when you go to England, for example, it takes you a while to really understand the sense of the concept they have of class,
right,
which is so important in English. And here in America, we really don't care too much about that. We don't judge people so much as they judge people just by the way they speak.
Right.
So that's quite interesting. Well, tell me about then what's going to be your next project, what you're going to be working that you think will be exciting.
Well, the project that I've been immersed in for the last year or so is something completely new for me, which I've never done before, which is a biography. It's actually pretty common for translators to move into biography precisely because you have to understand the person you're translating at such a deep level that at some point you know so much about their life, that you start writing a life. So many translators who've become very immersed in the work of a writer end up writing biographies of that writer. And in my case, the writer whose work I've been most immersed in is José Martí. I did a Penguin Classics edition of the selected writings of Martí a number of years ago, and since then I've worked a lot, done a lot of research on Martí. And my biography, there's already 50 biographies of Martí, so this is in no way, something that no one has done before, but Martí remains unknown in New York City. When I go around talking to people who are not Hispanic, who don't come from Latino backgrounds, they say, who is José Martí? And the fact of the matter is that José Martí is one of the greatest figures in the history of this city. He lived in the city for 15 years. He's one of the greatest portrayers of this city. Basically, in terms of who lived in the city from 1880 to 1895, in world historical sense, Martí is probably the single most, or one of the two or three most important figures living in the city at that point. But we have school children right now, today, going through their entire education in New York City public schools, and they never hear the name José Martí. They never know that this is part of the history of their city. So my ambition with the biography that I'm writing is to look at Martí not so much in the context of the history of Cuba. Obviously, you have to understand him within that context, and that will be part of it. But to look at the incredibly close links between Havana and New York that existed, that were the reason for the Cuban community in that period, the reason for Martí's presence, and also to look at Martí as a New Yorker, as somebody who lived in and contributed to the life of this city and left behind this extremely rich body of writing that is virtual documentary footage of New York City in the 1880s and early 1890s, and that hasn't been exploited by historians, that is not being used by the people who write about the city. So it's kind of to introduce New York to one of its greatest heroes that it still doesn't know.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I hope that once you finish that work, I can invite you again to this show and talk about that particular biography.
I would love that.
Okay. Well, thank you very much to Dr. Esther Allen, the Department of Modern Languages and Literature at the Weissman School of Arts and Sciences at Baruch College. And next week, we're going to have Dr. Alison Griffith of the Department of Communications Studies at the Weissman School of Arts and Sciences, who will be talking about carceral stories of how movies are being seen in jail. So stay tuned.
This has been College Talk with Dean Aldemaro Romero Jr., a production of the Weissman School of Arts and Sciences at Baruch College. All rights reserved, 2016.